One of the things about Grafton Regis, it's just about as far from the sea as you'll ever get anywhere in England. So we've had to bring our own sea with us. And you'll see that there's a Danish invader there. And what's he going to do? He's going to try and stop the sea. And of course he fails. Who was he? Anybody? King Canute. And it was Canute's father, Sven Forkbeard, and in fact he's around here somewhere, very noticeable because he has a forked beard. He invaded England 3 times, and the 3rd time was in 1113 when he pillaged his way down to Northamptonshire. And here the first battle today at approximately 12 o'clock will feature Sven Forkbeard. In fact, Kathy's walking now with a picture around of him, so if you see him, just beware. So that's the first battle reenactment at 12 o'clock. I'm going to run through another 300 years to the year 1437, when a baby girl was born in this village at the Woodville Manor. Not just any girl, but a girl who would become probably noted as the most beautiful lady in the land. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville. She married Sir John Grey of Groby and went to live with him north of Leicester and had a couple of sons with him. But Sir John Grey was defeated at the Battle of St Albans. In fact, he was killed by Edward IV's army. And as was custom in those days, all of her estate, her house, her land was confiscated by Edward. She had nowhere to go but to return back to Grafton, and brought her sons with her. So there we have a very beautiful but very sad and distraught Elizabeth Woodville. But something that was going to change all that, and it not only changed her life, but it changed the course of English royal history, because she heard of the king, King Edward IV, was hunting in the local forest. And she went out to greet him. She took her children with him, we believe, and she threw herself at his mercy and to beg for the restoration of her lands. Well, Edward IV, 6'4", tall, handsome king, bit of a one for the ladies. And he said, in medieval English, "How about it, darling?" And she said, "Oh no." And the story goes that he even took a knife to her throat. But she resisted. Resisted until they were married. And in fact, they marry in secret in Grafton on May the 1st, 1464. Now, what on earth was a king of England doing, marrying, first of all, a commoner with 2 children by one of his enemies? Well, we think it was love. Probably the first royal love that England had ever had, and he was certainly the first English king to get married outside of London. Now, he was betrothed to a princess in France, and so later on we'll see that because of that betrothal, it was claimed that this marriage was illegitimate. But they lived a very happy life together. She bore him 10 children. 10! Now, poor old Edward, he liked the good life. He liked eating, hunting, things like that. He became absolutely obese. It's hard to imagine this fine actor being obese, but come back next year. But he sadly died at the age of 41 from a massive stroke, leaving poor Elizabeth with these children. Now, her oldest son, Edward V, or destined to be Edward V. Where is he? Is he here? Oh, we've lost him. Well, Edward was not yet of age to become king. He was only about 9 or 10. And he was in great danger, and we shall see why. Because Edward IV's brother, Richard of Gloucester, portrayed by Shakespeare as a monster, did in fact confiscate, first of all, the youngest son, sorry, the second son, Richard, and then sent him on a nice little holiday to the Tower of London. And Edward, destined to be Edward V, was captured by Richard's men at Stony Stratford, and also sent for a holiday to the Tower of London, where they were seen playing joyfully for several days until they completely disappeared. These were the princes in the Tower, murdered, suspected to be smothered in their sleep, and it wasn't until the reign of Charles II, during some work at the Tower, that they found 2 skeletons which were of the right age, and they're now buried in a urn in Westminster Abbey. So Elizabeth Woodville, distraught, she lost her 2 sons, but she still had daughters. And in fact it was Elizabeth, Duke of York, her oldest daughter, that was to play another major role, because Richard III was challenged by Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth near Leicester, and Richard III died in battle. Did a full charge down the hill, Campion Hill, and was slaughtered. A horse, my kingdom for a horse, they say. And so Henry Tudor became king. He picked up Richard's crown that had fallen off his head, and he was virtually crowned on the spot. And this is the start of the Tudor dynasty. Now, Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York. So once again, Elizabeth Woodville's family play a significant role in the kingship of this country. Elizabeth of York and Henry VII produce that infamous King Henry VIII. And here's good old Henry in all his splendour. Now Henry came here for the hunting, just as Edward IV had come. And in fact he enlarged the small medieval hunting ground into a massive hunting park of about 20 miles diameter. So every part of the scenery you can see from here was part of Henry's reign. He swallowed all the local villages for 20 miles diameter. Massive park.
Okay.
He brought Anne Boleyn here, the beautiful Anne Boleyn that he was smitten with. Now, when he brought her here, he was still married to Catherine of Aragon. And once again, Anne Boleyn followed Elizabeth Woodville. She refused his advances until they were married, but they couldn't be married. Now there was one year, I'm just going to tell you a little bit of, there was one year when Henry and Anne didn't come here, and that was in 1529. No, it wasn't, it was 1528. And we're going to give you a clue why Henry didn't come here. Now you might be mistaken to think they had some of that beer that was drunk last night, but no, these are plague victims. The plague was rife in the villages around Grafton in 1528, preventing Henry coming here for his beloved hunting. But by 1529 all was back to normal, and Henry employed a Mr. Fix-It. Cardinal Wolsey was confident he could persuade the Pope to give him a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and enable him to be free to marry Anne Boleyn. And for many months, Wolsey was his trusted advisor. A chap called Campeggio, who was the Pope's envoy, came all the way from Rome to Grafton Regis to tell of the Pope's decision. And it wasn't good. It was, in fact, no. Well, you can imagine, Henry was furious. Anne hated Wolsey anyway. She was furious because this was going to block her becoming the Queen of England. Wolsey was sent away in absolute disgrace. Grafton was the last place that they met, the last saw each other. And Wolsey goes up to Leicester, and within a couple of weeks, he's dead. So what do you do when the Pope prevents you from having a divorce and marrying your love? Well, you start your own church. Simple as that. The formation of the Church of England. So it has its roots back to the events that started here in Grafton. Henry marries Anne. But the long courtship, which had been so happy, is thrown into disarray because Anne cannot produce him a son. She produces him a daughter, but that's not good enough for our Henry. Well, a few misdemeanors, and before long, the beautiful Anne Boleyn, the love of Henry's life, meets her death in the Tower. The only saving grace, he allowed a sword for a swift slice, single slice of her head. Bye-bye, Anne. Thank you for coming. Now, if Henry had known this, that his daughter was in fact going to be the future Queen Elizabeth I, he probably wouldn't have been so obsessed with having a son. But that in fact was the result of the short marriage, in that it led to Elizabeth I. So the connection between Elizabeth I and Elizabeth Woodville is that Elizabeth I was the great-granddaughter of our own Elizabeth Woodville. And all that brought with the exploration and the power that England developed in those years. And of course, in the Tudor times, there was a popular, well, many authors and playwrights, the most famous being Shakespeare, who really was did a lot of propaganda to support the Tudor cause. And it's quite possible that there was a connection here, in that Elizabeth I, one of her favourite suitors, was in fact at Grafton, and it's possible that there's a link between the Earl of Dudley and his patronage of Shakespeare. And later on, a painting was discovered in Grafton in 1910. It was in a cottage next to the White Hart pub, and it was secreted away in a chamber. And when it was discovered, it was thought, and some people still think, it is the earliest known portrait of William Shakespeare. It has WS on the back, for example, and it has his age and a date, and they all correspond to William Shakespeare. Now, there is a talk at 1 o'clock in the church about the Grafton portrait, well worth going to, and Keith Harry will be giving that. Sorry, I think it's 1:30, that talk. Moving on then, from the Elizabethan period, we come up to the Civil War. And Grafton featured in the Civil War with a particularly nasty skirmish. And in fact, we have here today a Lady Crane who's going to tell us about what happened during those frightening days of the Civil War. Here she is with members of her family.
I'll tell you a tale of woe and destruction It happened here in the Civil War time when brother was against brother, king against parliament. And I thought I'd go somewhere really nice and quiet, somewhere like this, out into the peaceful countryside, get away from the dreadful Civil War. I took my family with me, but then a gentleman turns up, knocks on the door and says, "We want to use your house because we are going to stop the Roundheads from coming up and moving on to the King at Oxford." I said, "Well, can you not go elsewhere to get to Oxford? Can you not go round? We're here." "No, we're going to take over your house with our horses and our fodder and our army, and we're moving in." And so they moved in to the manor that was up there where the manor house now stands, but it was a different manor house I rented. It was the end of Henry VIII's palace, a huge house. And sure enough, the Roundheads came. Behind you, they marched up that hill with loads of men with muskets, the new model army, and they laid siege to the manor house. And the musket balls came through the windows, and the cannon, they threw great big cannonballs through the walls into the dining room where my children were, my family were. And of course they started to cry, and therefore we looked at giving up the house and saying, "We will surrender." But the Roundheads said, "Unconditional surrender. We want to take everybody prisoner except the women and children." And we carried on fighting, but more men were dying. So in the end, the Royalists said, "We will surrender." And we were cast out into the snow. I'd rented this house, it was all comfortable, and it was a freezing, thick, deep frost and snow, and we had nothing. We had to leave behind all our plate and jewellery and nothing but what we could stand up in, and some of our livestock we took out, and we looked back and the house was on fire. They burnt it down. Henry VIII's palace was burnt to the ground, and nothing stood there for another 100 years. And that's what happened to us in the Civil War.
Thank you, Lady Crane. Moving on from the Civil War, the manor at Grafton was destroyed, but it was re-established when Charles II's son, by Barbara Villiers, was appointed the first Duke of Grafton. He didn't live here, but subsequent dukes lived here and at Wakefield, which is Pottersbury, just a few miles away. And Robert Fitzroy, a member of the family, was in the Navy. He grew up as a boy at Wakefield, and he was surveying various coasts along South Africa, and he was then given the appointment to be the commander of the Beagle. And he invited a gentleman that's well represented. In fact, if you look on the back of a £10 note, you'll see his picture. He was in fact Charles Darwin, then an unknown botanist. Robert Fitzroy spent 6 years in the same cabin as Charles Darwin. They became good friends until Darwin published his book on evolution. Robert Fitzroy went on to become the governor of New Zealand, and then came back to England to join what was then the early days of the Met Office. And in those days they used to record the weather. He had the idea of forecasting the weather, the first person in the world to do so. And in fact the word forecast can be attributed to Robert Fitzroy. Now there's a talk about Robert in the church by one of his descendants, Charles Fitzroy, and that will take place at 1 o'clock. And Robert Fitzroy was recently commemorated with a plaque in the church, you'll see that. But also, if you listen to the weather forecast on Radio 4, the general synopsis, the weather forecast for shipping, they've renamed an area that was called Finisterre in memory of Fitzroy. It's called Fitzroy. So listen out to him every day on the general synopsis. Another notable Victorian in Grafton was Isabella Sams, who revived the lace industry, but she's more importantly known for doing some wonderful watercolour paintings of the village. There's about 20 or 30 of them, and you can buy cards today that represent those pictures. They're only, I think, a pack of 6 for £1.50. Now, we've just given you a very short potted history of the key points in Grafton's history. There is, in fact, a CD-ROM that's available today for £5. It'll take you a week to read through it all, but it's very detailed of not only the history of Grafton, but of also the Grafton estate, which still existed up until about 1920, including all of the villages centred around Grafton. So that completes our potted history. So can we just give a round of applause to the actors? And I'm going to hand you over to another compere who's going to describe the battle that you're now going to see.